Thank you, Madam President. Save the Children and Lawyers for Human Rights welcome the report of the Working Group on the UPR of South Africa, in particular the recommendations relating to children's rights. We call on the South African government to address the following issues. Several recommendations call on the South African government to take measures to improve the security of citizens and enhance the protection of particularly vulnerable groups, such as women and children, including through stronger mechanisms to protect women and girls from gender-based violence and provide redress to victims. We call on the government to take measures and develop comprehensive strategies to end violence against women and children. We encourage the government to continue extensively training of personnel in the justice administrative structures, including social workers, police officers, magistrates, and advocates on the prevention of women and children abuse, and to put in place more coordinated programs that reduce violence against women and children. Recommendations 124.88 calls on the government to prohibit corporal punishment in all settings, including the home, as well as in public institutions such as schools and prisons. We call on the government to take steps for the prohibition of all forms of corporal punishment in all settings. Several recommendations call on the government to strengthen educational strategies that ensure that all children enroll in school and to maintain its commitment to improve the quality of education. We call upon the government to take this commitment seriously and to put in place measures that ensure basic and quality education for all. We also encourage government to provide adequate and timely resources, appoint good leadership in schools, and to train enough qualified teachers in all state schools. Recommendations 124.151 calls on the government to ensure that all children are issued with a birth certificate in order to access various social services, with particular focus on children of migrants. We call on the government to put in place child-friendly measures to ensure all children, migrants and orphans are registered.
Muchas gracias. This one.
Thank you, Madam President. The Association for the Prevention of Torture, APT, calls on South Africa to ratify the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture, OPCAT, this year. While APT welcomes South Africa's acceptance of UPR recommendations to ratify the OPCAT, we note that South Africa has been saying that ratification is in process since 2007. South Africa was an early leader on OPCAT, playing a significant role in drafting the treaty and signing it in 2006. In 2007, when South Africa stood for election to this body, it said OPCAT ratification was in process. In 2008, OPCAT ratification was recommended during the first UPR review. In May, for this review, South Africa submitted a forward by its president stating that South Africa is in the process of ratifying OPCAT, and an annex stating that South Africa envisions depositing the instrument of ratification during the annual treaty event in New York, which starts next week. The time is now for South Africa to demonstrate its commitment to preventing torture and other ill treatment by ratifying OPCAT and by engaging in an open, transparent, and inclusive public consultation on the establishment of a national preventive mechanism. With regard to the prohibition and criminalization of torture, the APT welcomes that a hearing was held on the Prevention and Combating of Torture of Persons Bill earlier this month in the Justice Portfolio Committee of the Parliament. The APT urges South Africa to ensure that the definition of the crime of torture in the final law does in fact meet the minimum standards set out in Articles 1 and 4 of the United Nations Convention Against Torture. Further, APT calls on South Africa to implement the UNCAT by amending the bill to include provisions that, among other things, provide for full redress and reparations for victims of torture and set out in statutory form the exclusion of statements acquired through the use of torture. Thank you, Madam President.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Thank you for giving us the floor. Madam President, IIMA and Vides International welcomes the constructive participation of South Africa at the Universal Periodic Review. However, we remain concerned regarding persisting deficiencies in the implementation of several economic, social and cultural rights, among which are the right to water and sanitation, right to food, right to adequate housing, and the right to education. In particular, children belonging to indigenous communities are the most affected. Concerning education, while welcoming the very high rate of enrollment and retention in primary school, we express our deepest concern regarding the poor quality of basic education and dropout rates in secondary education. Moreover, discrimination persists in the school system with a large disparity between students. Even though the government has prohibited corporal punishment at school, violence against children still occurs at home and schools. Some episodes of ill treatment against children by police officers have also been reported. Finally, South Africa faces a considerable challenge in relation to child mortality, maternal mortality, as well as HIV/AIDS rates. Therefore, we recommend South Africa to ratify the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in order to improve the enforcement of this right for all, adopt adequate measures to combat any kind of discrimination affecting mainly indigenous people and the poorest section of the population, increase the secondary education completion rate, eradicate corporal punishment in family, school and penal institutions, and undertake education campaigns and human rights training in order to educate parents and police forces. Intensify the efforts to combat HIV/AIDS, especially among young people. Thank you very much.
We'll give the floor to Human Rights Watch.
Thank you. Human Rights Watch welcomes the UPR report of South Africa. We commend progress in providing greater access for vulnerable communities to services in areas such as education, housing, health and social security, and welcome that it accepted many recommendations. However, we are concerned that greater access has not been necessarily matched by progressive improvement in quality. We therefore urge the government to review its current policy in this regard. We are also concerned about the non-delivery of textbooks to students in the Limpopo for the first 7 months of the 2012 school year. We welcome the amendments made to the Protection of State Information Bill, but regret that South Africa could not accept recommendations in this regard. We are still concerned that such changes have not gone far enough. The bill provides that it is supreme to any other law that deals with classified information, and therefore, when in conflict with provisions such as the Promotion of Access to Information Act, would be given precedence. This would have a regressive impact, and we urge the government to amend it accordingly. We commend the engagement taken by South Africa during the UPR to address gender-based violence and discrimination based on the ground of sexual orientation. We welcome efforts by the government and the establishment of the National Task Team, but the draft Traditional Courts Bill in its current form is still contrary to the commitment to create a society based on equality, and we deeply regret that South Africa could not accept the recommendation made by Norway in this regard. The draft bill restricts access to justice, and its effect would further entrench gender inequalities in certain South African communities. We urge the government to review this bill so that it is in accordance with its international and national human rights obligations. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Madam President. The ICJ welcomes South Africa's acceptance of UPR recommendations on the prevention and punishment of sexual and gender-based violence, and its pledge to ensure that its immigration laws and policies are consistent with its constitution and human rights commitments. It is hoped that those recommendations will soon be acted upon to ensure that policing practices and immigration management contribute positively to the prevention and punishment of violence against women, children and non-nationals. The ICJ also notes with satisfaction South Africa's commitment to do all in its power to sign and ratify before the end of 2012 all outstanding instruments in the area of international human rights and humanitarian law. It is our great expectation that this groundbreaking step will be made and followed by appropriate measures for prompt and effective domestic implementation. The ICJ nevertheless wishes to express serious concern that South Africa has not accepted several recommendations, including that it adopt a more integrated and effective approach to break the cycle of sexual and xenophobic violence, and that it strengthen police accountability and oversight mechanisms to ensure respect for human rights in policing actions. The recent tragedy at the Lonmin mines underscores the need for effective professional training and accountability of police officers, and also the imperative to fully implement economic and social rights, the denial of which can generate violence. The ICJ strongly urges South Africa to respond positively to all UPR recommendations and to adopt appropriate measures to implement them, including through updating this Council
South 21
on
has a long-standing and strong appreciation for the people of South Africa. We assisted their struggle for self-determination at the end of apartheid, as our honorary president for a short time before he became president of South Africa, His Excellency Mr. Nelson Mandela. North-South 21 recognizes that South Africa is still a state, emerging from a long and arduous past, and in this spirit, we welcome the committed efforts of the government to ensure respect for the social, economic, political, and civil rights of its people. As its laudable efforts to overcome past discrimination indicate, South Africa has been a beacon in the fight against racial discrimination. We urge it to continue to do so by leading a renewed effort to encourage attention, support, and implementation of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action that was proudly adopted by consensus of the international community in Durban, South Africa, more than 10 years ago. While some would like to belittle this document, we urge South Africa to champion it and to encourage the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which is of course led by a South African activist who struggled against apartheid, to be the leading force in this effort. Finally, North-South 21 urges the government of South Africa to ensure the legacy that inspired so many activists to work to rid the world of racial discrimination and other associated forms of discrimination by enhancing its policies to ensure social and economic development for all the people of South Africa. Thank you.
Madam President, we note with satisfaction progress achieved in South Africa since the first UPR. We welcome the results in the following areas: poverty reduction, access to drinking water and to healthcare in rural areas, decent housing for millions of persons, the elimination of schooling costs, of school fees for categories of children, and also for underprivileged population. The improving the healthcare system and the establishment of hospitals and health centres, and also large-scale HIV screening and the provision of antiretroviral therapy and psychological assistance and so on has led to a 50% reduction in mother-child transmission. In addition, the constitutional prohibition of discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, and we welcome the establishment of a Ministry for Women, Children and the Handicapped, persons with disabilities. However, we continue to be concerned about a number of issues such as xenophobic violence and violence against various categories, including homosexuals. We also condemn the massacre of strikers outside the Marikana mine. We call upon the authorities to open a credible inquiry into these killings in order to punish the culprits. In addition, attention must be paid to women who are the victims of conjugal violence and rape. We also encourage the country to accede to or to ratify the following international instruments: the Convention Against Torture, the Convention for the Protection of the Rights of Migrant Workers, the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and the ICC's Agreement on Privileges and Immunities. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Madam President. I make the statement on behalf of the Sexual Rights Initiative. The SRI welcomes the Government of South Africa's commitment to accept and implement a range of recommendations related to combating incitement to hatred and punishing hate crimes. Gender and sexuality-related violence against women and against vulnerable people such as refugees, sex workers, people who are gender non-conforming, and people in same-sex relationships constitutes a national crisis. We highlight the reality that South Africa already has a host of laws, policies, frameworks and structures to address violence, gender inequality and sexuality. We call on South Africa to ensure the urgent, sustained implementation and application of these laws and policies through sustained dialogue and holding to account religious, traditional and political leaders when their statements and actions serve to legitimize the violence against women and against poor and marginalized people, ensuring the criminal justice system delivers justice in dealing with those who violate the human rights of women and people based on gender identity and sexual orientation. addressing the serious shortcomings in the implementation of refugee-related legislation, international human rights commitments and policies, including refoulement. Take urgent measures to address the concerns of human rights defenders about the serious threat to women's human rights posed by the Traditional Courts Bill. The policies and programs in implementation must empower women and address violent masculinities. Mechanisms for accountability must be in place at the highest political level. Thank you, Madam President.
No.
Madam President, Amnesty International welcomes South Africa's acknowledgement at its review of the need to strengthen the legal framework for combating torture. We commend South Africa for conducting public hearings on the Prevention and Combating of Torture of Persons Bill on the 4th of September. In a submission on the bill, Amnesty International urged that its scope be expanded to reflect the full extent of South Africa's obligations under the Convention Against Torture. We also urge South Africa to make rapid progress in ratifying the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture, as recommended in the review. Accumulating evidence indicates that torture and ill treatment have once again acquired a, quote, systematic character, end of quote. More needs to be done by the government to halt this trend. Madam President, Amnesty International urges South Africa to increase its commitment to prevent the excessive use of force and targeted killings by police. The killing by heavily armed police of 34 striking minors at Marikana last August, and the multiple targeted killings allegedly committed by members of a Durban-based police unit are two extremely worrying examples of an increasing trend in the last 5 years. Madam President, Amnesty International notes South Africa's intention to develop a comprehensive immigration policy, including through a review of existing legislation, consultations with key stakeholders, and identifying best international practices. We are concerned, however, that over the past year, officials have failed to consult with stakeholders, even when ordered to do so by the courts. Evolving policy is dismantling the asylum system and rendering non-discriminatory access to protection increasingly difficult, resulting in increased risk of fines, detentions, or refoulement for those unable to access services. We urge South Africa to uphold and protect the rights of asylum seekers and refugees and to renew its commitment to the system of international protection while seeking to address the needs of impoverished South Africans. I thank you, Madam President.